welcome to the 8th session of our study in the book of Genesis. Today we're going to read chapters 20 through 23. We'll hear a second wife-sister story and read about the birth of Isaac. We will take a look at the Elohim source, the third of the primary sources used in compiling the Torah. We will also read the binding of Isaac, not the dark video game, but the most fearful and piteous story in the Hebrew Bible. But once again, we begin with a prayer. O God, our Father, open our eyes and enlighten our minds as we study your word. So grant that our minds may know your truth and our hearts may feel your love, and then confirm and strengthen our wills that we may go out to live what we have learned. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. In chapter 20, Abraham and Sarah start wandering or traveling again. This time they visit Gerar, which is southwest of Hebron near the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, close to Gaza, if you know where that is. So I'm going to begin by reading chapter 20, verses 1 through 7. And Abraham journeyed onward from there to the Negev region, and dwelt between Kadesh and Shur, and he sojourned in Gerar. And Abraham said of Sarah his wife, She is my sister. And Abimelech, the king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. And God came to Abimelech in the night dream, and said to him, You are a dead man because of the woman you took, as she is another's wife. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, My lord, will you slay a nation even if innocent? Did not he say to me, She is my sister? And she also said, He is my brother. With a pure heart and with clean hands I have done this. And God said to him in a dream, Indeed, I know that with a pure heart you have done this, and I on my part have kept you from offending against me. And so I have not allowed you to touch her. Now send back the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will intercede for you, and you may live. And if you do not send her back, know that you are doomed to die, you and all that belongs to you. So here's another sister-wife scene. This time there is no famine, and Abraham is not going to Egypt, but to Gerar, a Canaanite city-state in western Negev, but still north of the Egyptian line. We notice here that God comes directly to Abimelech. God spoke to Pharaoh only through plagues. Would you slay the innocent along with the guilty? Does this sound familiar? This goes back to the Sodom story in chapter 18, where Abraham asked God the same thing. Abimelech is effectively repeating Abraham's question. Will not the judge of all the earth do justice? Verse 7 is the only time the word prophet is used in the book of Genesis. So let's go on with verse 8 through 13. And Abimelech rose early in the morning and called to all his servants, and he spoke these things in their hearing, and the men were terribly afraid. And Abimelech called to Abraham and said to him, What have you done to us, and how have I offended you that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not be done you have done to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, What did you imagine when you did this thing? And Abraham said, For I thought there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. And it happened when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house, that I told her, This is the kindness you can do for me in every place to which we come. Say of me, he is my brother. So after being upbraided, Abraham stands silent, not knowing what to say. So in verse 10, Abimelech reproaches him again. Abraham's excuse is that, in fact, Sarah is his half-sister, his father's daughter, but not his mother's. He has this semi-incestuous marriage. So we remember Lot's daughter's act of incest in the last chapter. Abraham, it seems, is no better. Abraham's fear was that Gerar, like Sodom, was just like Sodom. He thought there was no fear of God in this place, which begs the question, why did he go there? In any event, he was wrong. Gerar, it was no Sodom. Then Abraham gives this feeble explanation. the gods have made him a wanderer. Going through 14 through 18. And Abimelech took sheep and cattle and male and female slaves and gave them to Abraham, and he sent him back to him Sarah his wife. And Abimelech said, "Look, my land is before you. Settle wherever you want." And to Sarah he said, "Look, I have given 1,000 pieces of silver to your brother. Let it hereby serve you as shield against the censorious eyes for everyone who is with you, and you are now publicly vindicated." And Abraham interceded with God, and God healed Abimelech and his wife and his slave women, and they gave birth. For the Lord had shut fast every womb in the house of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. So Abimelech offers all this bounteous restitution after Sarah leaves his harem. Only at the end of this story is impotence introduced. God has made Abimelech impotent, unable to touch Sarah, and shut fast every womb in the house. So we have this storyline from the past few chapters. We have the implausible promise of a son to Sarah. A whole people is wiped out, Sodom and Gomorrah and all the cities of the plain. The desperate act of procreation by Lot's daughters, because there are no men left in the world, they believe. Then an entire kingdom is blighted with an interruption of procreation. Now, in the next chapter, in the very first verse, remember there are no chapter or verse breaks in the original Hebrew text. In the very next verse, we will have the fulfillment of the promise of a son to Sarah. One side note here, the plague of infertility in Gerar guarantees that Abimelech cannot be imagined as the father of Isaac. But before we go on to chapter 21, I want to say some more about sources. We've talked about the J source, the Yahweh source, and about the P or the priestly source. But here for the first time we have a narrative that is from the E or the Elohim source. In fact, much of chapter 21 and chapter 22 are also from the Elohim source. This helps explain why we see a very similar wife-sister story about twice in Genesis. It's not that Abraham thought he would try it again in the Gerar because it worked so well in Egypt. We likely just have two versions of the same story, one from the J source and one from the E source. One took place in Egypt and one in Gerar. Both times Abraham loaded up with sheep and cattle and slaves and gold and silver and made out like a bandit because God was on his side. We previously talked about how the creation story in chapter 1 came from the P source and the story in chapter 2 came from the J source, and how the flood story of Noah was a combination of those two sources kind of intertwined together. So what's the deal with these different sources? So here is the theory in a nutshell. Tradition tells us that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah or the Pentateuch or the 5 books of Moses. But over time, people noticed what appeared to be contradictions, like the order of creation events seemed to be different in the first chapter of Genesis than in the second chapter. There were things discussed in the Torah that described events that happened long after Moses was dead. The Torah even describes Moses' death, something that would have seemed difficult for him to have written himself after he was dead. Occasionally, early scholars would write about these seeming discrepancies, but they did so somewhat surreptitiously to avoid being called heretics and then excommunicated or burned at the stake. By the late 17th century, scholars had identified 4 separate storylines. The J, P, and E for the first 4 books of the Bible, of the Torah, and D for the book of Deuteronomy. There seemed to be evidence that the 5 books of Moses had been composed by combining the 4 different source documents into one continuous history. In the late 19th century, Julius Wellhausen, a German biblical scholar, developed what was called the documentary hypothesis that tried to explain the process by which the 4 sources were used to create the Torah. While that general hypothesis is generally accepted by modern scholars, there are points of disagreement about the time frame in which a particular source was created or who the author or authors were. The general scheme is that the J source was written in the southern kingdom of Judah sometime after the division of Israel into 2 independent kingdoms in about 930 BCE. The e-source was written in the northern kingdom of Israel sometime before 722 BCE. The priestly source P was likely written after both the J and the e-sources, probably after 722 and prior to the return from exile in 538. The D source was written by the Deuteronomist shortly before or shortly after the exile to Babylon in 586. So that's a lot of dates and times, but that's generally the concept. As an aside, the Deuteronomist is also believed to have written or compiled, edited the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. It's not necessarily the case that any of these sources were written by any one individual. They could have been written by a single individual or by a group of writers together. At some point, a redactor or editor combined all four sources into what we know today as the Torah, or the 5 books of Moses. The redactor probably added a few lines here or there, probably had some other minor additional sources as well. The Book of Generations, for example, provides us our list of begats. Is also thought to have been a separate book that was divided up to be placed appropriately in different spots in the Torah. The redaction is generally thought to have taken place in the Persian period after 538 BC, but before Ezra is first said to have publicly read from the Torah in about 450. So now you know the basic story of how these different sources were used to compose the Torah. Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman is a good resource if you want to know more. Another resource could be The Bible Untangled by Charles Siegel, or How to Read the Hebrew Bible by Mark Zevi Bretler. You can also find authors who disagree with this hypothesis entirely. But now we move on to chapter 21, the birth of Isaac. So I'm going to read chapter 21, verse 1 through 5. And the Lord singled out Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. And Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the set time that God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son, who was born to him, whom Sarah had bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised Isaac his son when he was 8 days old, as God had charged him. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac his son was born to him. So God promised this way back in chapter 12 and several times since then, and now a son to Abraham and Sarah. Verses 6 and 7. And Sarah said, Laughter has God made me. Whoever hears will laugh at me. And she said, Who would have uttered to Abraham, Sarah is suckling sons? For I have borne a son in his old age. Laughter has God made me. This could refer to Isaac's name, or it could be the laughter of triumphant joy, or it could be the laughter of the absurdity of the whole thing. All who hear may rejoice with her, but they also may laugh at her as a new mom. You notice here she only mentions Abraham as being really old for having a new son. Nothing about how old she is. 21, 8 through 13. And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day Isaac was weaned. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And she said to Abraham, Drive out this slave girl and her son, for the slave girl's son shall not inherit with my son, with Isaac. And the thing seemed evil in Abraham's eyes because of his son. And God said to Abraham, Let it not seem evil in your eyes on account of the lad and on account of your slave girl. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her voice. For through Isaac shall your seed be acclaimed, but the slave girl's son too I will make a nation, for he is your seed. So here Sarah refers to the slave girl and her son. She doesn't mention their names, by which she indicates their low social status. God tells Abraham to listen to Sarah's voice. In the next scene, we have God who hears Ishmael's voice. In verse 13, God says that, again, that he will make a great nation of the slave girl's son, Ishmael. couple chapters down the road, we're going to see the genealogy of the Ishmaelites. It's chapter 25. And when we hear about them in the Ishmaelites again in the Joseph stories in chapter 37 and 39, but after that, they don't appear again in the Torah. Let's go through 14 through 18. And Abraham rose early in the morning, and he took bread and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, placing them on her shoulder. And he gave her the child and sent her away. And she went wandering through the wilderness of Beersheba. And when the water in the skin was gone, she flung the child under one of the bushes and went off and sat down at a distance, a bow shot away, for she thought, "Let me not see when the child dies." And she sat at a distance and raised her voice and wept. And God heard the voice of the lad, and God's messenger called out from the heavens and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the lad's voice where he is. Rise, lift up the lad, and hold him by the hand, for a great nation will I make of him." Abraham rises early in the morning. He does that again in the next chapter when he takes his other son up the mountain. In verse 16, it says, Hagar went a bow shot away. This hints at Ishmael's future as a bowman that we hear about a few verses later. Remember, Ishmael would have been about 15 or 16 years old at this time. He's not a baby anymore. Verse 17 says, and God heard the voice of the lad. Remember, Ishmael means God has heard. It's another play on words. Genesis 21, 19 through 21. And God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. And she went and filled the skin with water and gave to the lad to drink. And God was with the lad, and he grew up and dwelled in the wilderness, and he became a seasoned bowman. And he dwelled in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt. So this narrative foreshadows the story of Isaac in the next chapter. Journeying into the unknown, a child at the point of death, the intervention of God's messenger, the promise of future blessing. We see all that again in chapter 22. Let's read verse 22 through 30. And it happened at that time that Abimelech, the Phicol, captain of his troops with him, said to Abraham, saying, God is with you in whatever you do. Therefore swear to me by God that you will not deal falsely with me, with my kith and kin. Like the kindness I have done you, so you shall do for me, and for the land in which you have sojourned. And Abraham said, I indeed will swear it. But Abraham upbraided Abimelech concerning the well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. And Abimelech said, I do not know who has done this thing, and you, too, have not told me, and I myself never heard it until this day. And Abraham took sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two of them sealed a pact. And Abraham set apart 7 ewes of the flock. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what are these 7 ewes that you set apart? And he said, now the 7 ewes you shall take from my hand, so that they may serve me as witness that I have dug this well. So now we go back to continue the Abimelech story from chapter 20. We interrupted that story to tell about the birth of Isaac and the banishment of Ishmael. Now this interlude that separates the larger story of life threats of Abraham's 2 sons. Remember, Abimelech has promised Abraham the right to settle in his territory. Now Abimelech is concerned about how much land Abraham is utilizing, so he proposes a treaty to ensure that Abraham doesn't encroach too much onto his territory. We'll go on with 31 through 34. Therefore did he call the name of that place Beersheba, for there did the 2 of them swear. And they sealed a pact in Beersheba, and Abimelech rose, and Phicol, captain of his troops, with him. And they returned to the land of the Philistines. And Abraham planted a tamarisk at Beersheba, and he invoked there the name of the Lord, everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines many days. So Beersheba is what he named it. Beer means well where you get water. Sheba can mean either oath or 7, the number. Abraham had 7 ewes, and of course the number 7 is always an important number in the Bible. Thus Abraham named the place Beersheba, which is not yet a town, it's just a place where there is a well and you can get water. Back in verse 14, we read about Hagar in the wilderness in Beersheba. So these stories may be out of sequence, or the author may have just been describing an area that his readers several hundred years later would know about. We also mentioned the land of the Philistines here a couple of times. The Philistines didn't actually arrive for another 400 years, but the early readers of this narrative knew where that land was. They knew what we were talking about. We talked about the Philistines. Now we go on to chapter 22. And this is the binding of Isaac, and I'm going to read this from Everett Fox's translation. You remember in Fox's translation, Avraham means Abraham, and Yitzhak is Isaac. So I'm going to start with verses 1 through 5. Now after these events, it was that God tested Avraham and said to him, Avraham, he said, here I am. He said, pray take your son, your only one, whom you love, Yitzhak, and go you forth to the land of Moriah Sin, and offer him up there as an offering upon one of the mountains that I will tell you of. Abraham started early in the morning. He saddled his donkey. He took his 2 serving lads with him, and Yitzhak his son. He split wood for the offering up, and arose and went to the place that God had told him of. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Abraham said to his lads, you stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad wish to go yonder. We wish to bow down and then return to you. So I want you to listen for the different conjugations of the verb to see in these passages, and we'll have several of those. But verse 1 through 5, God seemed to have retracted his promise of progeny to Abraham and Sarah. The one thing that stands out in this passage is Abraham's silence, his mute acceptance of and acting on God's command. There is no sleepless night. He never says a word to God. He is described with a series of verbs. Starting early, saddling, taking, splitting, arising, going. This is Abraham the great negotiator. He bargains with his nephew, with his allies, with local kings, and even God himself. And yet, here he falls completely silent. God begins with, take your son, your only one, the one you love. There are echoes here of the beginning of chapter 12, where God said, go forth from your land, your birthplace, and your father's house. Here he is told to go forth upon one of the mountains that I will tell you of. Then it was go forth to the land that I will show you. After this episode, God will never speak to Abraham again. We know about Ishmael, but from Abraham's emotional perspective, Isaac, Yitzhak, the sole son by his legitimate wife Sarah, is his only son. Mount Moriah, the place where they're going, was the site of Solomon's temple. Let's go on to 6 through 10. Abraham took the wood from the offering up. He placed them upon Yitzhak his son. In his hand he took the fire and the knife. Thus the 2 of them went together. Yitzhak said to Abraham his father, he said, Father, he said, here I am, my son. He said, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering up? Abraham said, God will see for himself to the lamb for the offering up, my son. Thus the 2 of them went together. They came to the place that God had told him of. There Abraham built the slaughter site and arranged the wood and bound Yitzhak his son and placed him on the slaughter site atop the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand. He took the knife to slay his son. So Yitzhak carries the wood, but Abraham carries the butcher knife and the fire, the dangerous objects with which the boy might hurt himself. We have God will see to the sheep. We have Abraham seeing the place from afar, seeing on the mount of the Lord. The knife Abraham uses is probably a sharp-edged butcher cleaver, not just a knife. In contrast to the rapid pace of the narrative as a whole, the pace is changed almost to slow motion here at the end. Building the altar, laying out the wood, binding the child on top of the wood, reaching out the hand with the butcher knife. We go on with 11 through 19. But Yahweh's messenger called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham, he said. Here I am. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do not do anything to him. For now I know that you are in awe of God. You have not withheld your son, your only one, from me. Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw there a ram caught behind in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and he took the ram and offered it up as an offering up in place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place Yahweh Sees. As the saying is today, on Yahweh's mountain it is seen. And Yahweh's messenger called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, by myself I swear, Yahweh's utterance, indeed because you have done this thing, have not withheld your son, your only one, indeed I will bless you, bless you. I will make your seed many, yes, many, like the stars of the heavens and like the sand that is on the shore of the sea. Your seed shall inherit the gate of their enemies. All the nations of the earth shall enjoy blessing through your seed, in consequence of your hearkening to my voice. Abraham returned to his lads. They arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham stayed in Beersheba. So we exhale. The messenger of the Lord calls out, just as the messenger called out to Hagar in the wilderness as she and Ishmael were about to die. Abraham holds the knife. Hagar is asked to hold her hand on the boy. We can see the parallels here. In the end, each of the sons is promised to become the progenitor of a great people. We still see the verb see here. In verse 13, we see a ram is caught, and Abraham called the name of the place, on the mount of the Lord there is sight, or Yahweh sees. One other footnote here in verse 18, God promises for the third time, all the nations of the earth shall enjoy the blessing through your seed. Verses 20 through 24, we go on to a genealogical list. Now after these events it was told to Abraham, saying, here Milcah too has borne sons to Nahor your brother, Utz his firstborn, and Buz his brother, Kemuel father of Aram, and Sesed, Hazo, Pildash, Yidlaph, and Butel. Now Butel begot Rivkah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abram's brother. And his concubine, her name was Rumah, bore 2, Teva, Gaham, Tahash, and Makkah. So Abraham's brother back in Mesopotamia has 12 sons, similar to the 12 tribes of Israel that were Abraham's descendants. But the critical name in this list for us is Nahor's granddaughter, Rebecca. So we're going to go on with chapter 23. We're back with Robert Alter's translation here. 23 verses 1 through 9. And Sarah's life was 127 years, the years of Sarah's life. And Sarah died at Kiriath Arba, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn Sarah and to keen for her. And Abraham rose from before his dead, and he spoke to the Hittites, saying, I am sojourning settler with you. Grant me a burial holding with you, and let me bury my dead before me. And the Hittites answered Abraham, saying, Pray hear us, my lord. You are a prince of God among us. In the pick of our graves bury your dead. No man among us will deny you his grave for burying your dead. And Abraham rose and bowed to the folk of the land, to the Hittites, and he spoke with them, saying, If you have it in your hearts that I should bury my dead now before me, hear me, entreat me, Ephron, son of Zohar, and let him grant me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him, which is at the far end of his field. At the full price, let him grant it to me in your midst as the burial holding. So Abraham is what we would call a resident alien. In spite of the fact that the Lord has promised him all the land of Canaan, he holds title to no land. He is asking the Hittites to sell him a burial holding. He doesn't use the term sell, but his objective is clearly permanent legal possession here. He is called the Prince of God, and he is told he can take his pick, but there was no reference to holding or transfer of property in that. Abraham asked for a particular piece of property at the end of a field, a cave, meaning that he won't have to cross any property to get to it. He also offers to pay full price. So this is a sale, not a gift or a grant that we're talking about. Verse 10 through 15. And Ephron was sitting in the midst of the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, all the assembled in the gate of his town, saying, Pray, my lord, hear me. The field I grant you, and the cave that is in it, I grant it to you in full view of my kinfolk. I grant it to you, bury your dead. And Abraham bowed before the folk of the land, and he spoke to Ephron in the hearing of the folk of the land, saying, If you would but hear me, I give the price of the field. Take it from me, and let me bury my dead there. And Ephron answered Abraham, saying, Pray, my lord, hear me. Land for 400 silver shekels between me and you. What does it come to? Go bury your dead. So Abraham only wanted the cave at the end of the field, but Ephron grants Abraham the field as well, which would increase the price. The grant would allow Abraham access, but he wants to buy it and have inalienable rights. Ephron offers to sell it for an extortionist rate that he calls a pittance. But Abraham is offered to pay full price, so he won't haggle. Verse 16 through 20, through the end of the chapter. And Abraham heeded Ephron, and Abraham weighed out to Ephron the silver that he was spoke of in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 silver shekels at the merchant's tried weight. And Ephron's field at Machpelah by the Mamre, the field and the cave that was in it, and every tree in the field within its boundaries all around passed over to Abraham as possession, in the full view of the Hittites, all the assembled in the gate of his town. And then Abraham buried Sarah his wife in the cave of the Machpelah field by Mamre, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan, and the field and the cave that it was passed over to Abraham as a burial holding from the Hittites. That's the end of chapter 23. So thematically, this story matches the narrative of the binding of Isaac. The promise of seed is threatened with the order to sacrifice his son. Now the promise of land is being mocked as he is forced to pay an exorbitant price for the mere gravesite. Today we read the narrative of Abraham's dealings with Abimelech, the king of Gerar. We heard about the birth of Isaac, his son, the death of Sarah, his wife. His other son Ishmael and Ishmael's mother Hagar were sent off to the wilderness, and Abraham purchased a field and a cave in which to bury Sarah. But we're haunted by the story of Abraham taking Isaac, his only son, up the mountain to do the sacrifice. We are haunted mostly by Abraham's silence. He challenged God about his plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, but not a peep to protect the life of his own son. Why? How is that possible? One possible answer is that the mark of Abraham's personality is obedience. He obeys God. Leave your land, leave your birthplace, leave your father's house, circumcise yourself, sacrifice your child. But in the case of Sodom and Gomorrah, he is not commanded to do anything. God opened the door for Abraham to speak, and he did. A second possibility is that in the case of his son, Abraham hardly has standing as an impartial observer to argue the justice or injustice of the case. A third possible explanation is if the outcome of the Sodom and Gomorrah matter itself is what causes Abraham to stay silent in the case of his son, of Isaac. As Abraham bargains with God for the lives of the innocent, he makes each request seem to be a small one. 50 innocent, 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. God agrees not to destroy the cities if 10 innocent people can be found. Then he walks away. Remember, God is omniscient. He already knows how many innocent people can be found. God already knows what's in Abraham's heart. After the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham never again argues with God. So, Abraham got up early in the morning, made his preparations, took 2 lads, the donkey and his son Isaac, to the place that God had said to him. In verse 5 of chapter 22, Abraham told the lads to wait for him by the donkey. We'll come back to you. In verse 19, Abraham went back to the lads. It doesn't mention Isaac. Isaac and Abraham apparently do not go back together. In fact, in the remainder of the book of Genesis, Isaac and Abraham are never quoted as speaking to each other again. Next week, we will read chapters 24 through 26, Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Esau, the death of Abraham, and the beginning of the Jacob narrative. In the meantime, be safe. We hope to see you Wednesday.